The first time I saw my father cry in public, he was standing in the middle of the Maplewood Veterans Hall holding a folded newspaper with my photograph on the front page. Not a wedding picture, not a graduation portrait, a Pentagon security photo. I was walking beside a senior defense official in Washington, D.C. wearing my Navy dress whites, while two armed federal agents escorted us toward a secure entrance. The article headline read, "Ohio-born Navy officer helps lead emergency evacuation of American civilians." My father stared at that picture like he was looking at a stranger. Then he said the words nobody in that room ever expected to hear from Frank Whitmore. I think I may have been wrong about my daughter. The room went silent. My brother Danny nearly dropped his coffee. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. And me, I wasn't even there to hear it. I was sitting alone in a government sedan outside Arlington National Cemetery when my phone started vibrating for the fourth time in 10 minutes. "Mom calling." I let it ring. The driver pretended not to notice. Outside the window, November rain slid slowly down rows of bare trees and white headstones. Washington always looked colder than Ohio, even when the temperatures matched. Maybe because everybody there carried invisible things on their shoulders. Finally, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail. "Rebecca," my mother said softly, "please call us back. We need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow." Family meeting? I almost laughed out loud. For 38 years, nobody in my family had ever called a meeting when I was hurting. Not when I left for Annapolis. Not during deployments. Not after Grandma Eleanor died. But one newspaper photo later, suddenly everybody wanted to talk. I leaned back against the seat and closed my eyes. And just like that, I was 12 years old again. Back in Maplewood, Ohio. Back before I understood that some families can love you and still never truly see you. Maplewood was the kind of small Midwestern town where people still mowed lawns in straight lines and waved at strangers from pickup trucks. My father worked 32 years at the Champion Tool Factory before they downsized half the plant in the early 2000s. My mother worked part-time at the church office. We weren't poor, but every dollar had a purpose. My brother Danny fit naturally into that world. Football captain, loud laugh, easy confidence. The kind of man people slapped on the back at barbecues. I was quieter. Books, school, structure. And from the time I was little, my father looked at me like I was built wrong somehow. Not bad, just disappointing. Danny could bring home a C- report card and Dad would say, "That boy's got people skills. That matters more than grades." I once brought home straight A's and a county writing award. Dad nodded without looking up from the television. "That's nice, Becca." That was it. "That's nice." You'd be surprised how long a little sentence can live inside somebody. By high school, I stopped expecting applause. But my grandmother Eleanor noticed everything. Grandma lived in a small white house near the edge of town, with wind chimes hanging from the porch, and old military photographs tucked into drawers she rarely opened. Most people in Maplewood only knew her as a church volunteer who baked peach cobbler for funerals. What they didn't know was that Eleanor Whitmore had once been an army nurse in Korea. She never bragged about it, never wore veteran hats, never marched in parades, but sometimes late at night she'd sit at the kitchen table with coffee and tell me stories in a voice so calm they almost hurt more. Young boys missing legs, soldiers crying for mothers, cold mornings near field hospitals. "Service isn't glamorous," she told me once while polishing an old pair of military shoes. "Most important work happens quietly." I think she knew I needed to hear that, because by 16 I'd already learned my father measured worth in noise. And I wasn't noisy enough. The worst moment came my junior year of high school. Dad was outside grilling burgers while neighbors stood around drinking beer in our backyard. I was carrying empty soda cans inside when I heard one of the men ask about my college plans. Dad laughed. "Becca's smart, sure. But nobody builds a real legacy sitting behind military paperwork." Everybody chuckled politely. I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. Military paperwork. Like my dream already sounded foolish before it even began. That night, Grandma Eleanor drove me to Dairy Queen and listened while I cried in the passenger seat. She didn't insult my father. Didn't tell me life was unfair. She just handed me a napkin and said something I never forgot. "Don't argue with people who can't see your worth. Just keep walking until the world does." Years later, those words followed me through every difficult mile of my life. Through Annapolis. Through deployments. Through lonely apartments. Through holidays spent on military bases while Danny posted smiling family photos from backyard cookouts back home. And through the phone call that finally broke something open between my father and me. It happened 3 weeks before my promotion ceremony outside Washington. I stood in my apartment kitchen staring at the invitation while working up the courage to call home. I should have known better at 38 years old. But part of me still hoped. Dad answered on the third ring. "What's going on, Rebecca?" I explained carefully. "Promotion ceremony. Commander rank. Small event near D.C. Would mean a lot if they came." Long silence. Then his voice hardened. "Nobody cares about your cheap little promotion." I felt something inside me go completely still. My mother got on the line briefly afterward. "You know your father doesn't mean things harshly." But he did mean them. That was the problem. The ceremony happened anyway. Rows of white uniforms. Brass music drifting through cold air. Official speeches. Applause. Other officers hugging parents and spouses while cameras flashed. I stood alone afterward holding my cap under one arm, until I felt an old hand squeeze my shoulder. Captain Harold Bennett, 80 years old. Former Army medic. One of Grandma Eleanor's oldest friends. "She'd be proud of you," he said quietly. I nearly lost composure right there. Because sometimes a single sentence from the right person matters more than praise from everybody else combined. 3 months later, the Pentagon assignment changed my life. Then came the newspaper photo. Then came my mother's call. And now, sitting outside Arlington Cemetery with rain tapping softly against the car window, I finally listened to the voicemail again. "We need to talk. Family meeting tomorrow." I looked toward the cemetery gates and whispered the words I wished Grandma Eleanor could hear. "You were the only one who saw me before the world did." Then I told the driver to take me home to Ohio. By the time I crossed the Ohio state line, the trees had already turned the dull brown color that comes right before winter settles in for good. I hadn't driven home in nearly 8 months, long enough for the roads to feel familiar and distant at the same time. The farther west I drove from Washington, the quieter everything became. Less traffic, fewer sirens, more pickup trucks with veteran bumper stickers and rust forming around the wheel wells. I rolled the window down near Zanesville just to smell cold farmland again. People who grow up in small towns understand this feeling. No matter how far you go, part of your nervous system stays tied to old roads and grain silos and church bells. But as Maplewood got closer, my stomach tightened harder with every mile marker. Because deep down I knew this family meeting wasn't really about reconciliation. It was about recognition. And there's a difference. When I finally pulled into town, the first thing I noticed was the Christmas wreaths already hanging from downtown lampposts, even though Thanksgiving was still 2 weeks away. Maplewood always decorated early. The second thing I noticed was that people were staring at me. At the gas station. At the pharmacy parking lot. Even through diner windows. That newspaper article had traveled fast. Small towns survive on gossip the way cities survive on electricity. I stopped at Miller's Pharmacy to grab aspirin after the drive, and before I even reached the counter, old Mrs. Granger from church grabbed my arm. "Well, look at you," she said, smiling wide. "Pentagon and bodyguards now." I forced a polite laugh. "Mostly paperwork and coffee, honestly." She shook her head. "Your Grandma Eleanor would be over the moon." That hit me harder than I expected. Because almost nobody mentioned Grandma anymore. After she died, it felt like the town quietly folded her memory away into casseroles and funeral flowers. But not me. I carried her everywhere. Even now, I still kept her old service pin inside my coat pocket during difficult meetings. Mrs. Granger lowered her voice. "Your father's been acting strange since that article came out." I raised an eyebrow. "Strange how? He keeps buying extra newspapers." She smiled gently. "That man's probably read your article 20 times. I didn't know what to say to that. Because part of me wanted satisfaction. Another part wanted to cry. And another part, the tiredest part, just wanted everyone to stop making my worth sound surprising. I left the pharmacy and drove slowly toward my parents' neighborhood. Nothing there had changed. Same cracked sidewalks, same American flags hanging from porches, same little ranch houses built for factory families back when people believed one steady job could carry a household forever. Danny's truck was already parked outside Mom and Dad's house when I arrived. Of course it was. My older brother never missed a chance to control a room. I sat in my car for nearly 2 minutes before getting out. The November wind cut straight through my coat. And suddenly I remembered being 18 years old, standing in this exact driveway with 2 suitcases before leaving for Annapolis. Dad barely hugged me that day. Mom cried. Danny joked that I'd come home in 6 months begging for real food. Only Grandma Eleanor looked at me like she understood what it cost to leave home for service. I can still hear her final words before I climbed into that shuttle bus. "Walk steady. Not be fearless. Not be perfect. Just walk steady." The front door opened before I reached it. My mother rushed outside first. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, wrapping her arms around me. "Rebecca." She hadn't called me Rebecca with tenderness in years. Usually it was just Becca shouted across noisy family dinners. I hugged her back carefully. She smelled like hand lotion and cinnamon candles. For one brief second, I almost allowed myself to believe this visit might actually heal something. Then Danny appeared behind her. "Well," he said loudly, "look who finally remembered us little people." There it was. The old rhythm. Sarcasm disguised as humor. I forced a small smile. "Good to see you, too." Danny stepped forward and hugged me quickly, but something about it felt performative. Like he was already imagining himself telling people about his Pentagon sister at the bar later. Inside the house buzzed with noise. Aunts, cousins, even neighbors. I stopped dead near the living room doorway. "You invited people?" I asked quietly. Mom looked nervous immediately. "Well, folks were excited you were coming home." Excited. Interesting word. Nobody had been excited when I graduated Annapolis. Or during my first deployment. Or when Grandma Eleanor's funeral nearly emptied my savings because I paid for most of it myself while Danny complained about floral costs. But one newspaper article later, suddenly I was interesting. I kept my expression neutral. "Military training teaches you how to lock emotions behind your teeth." Still, my chest burned. Dad emerged from the dining room holding coffee. For a second, neither of us spoke. Frank Whitmore had aged more than I realized. His shoulders sagged lower now. More gray around the temples. His hands looked rougher, too. Factory hands. Working man hands. The kind that built half this country and silently destroyed the bodies attached to them. Then he nodded awkwardly. "Long drive." "About 7 hours." He cleared his throat. "Saw your article," I figured. Another silence. Everybody nearby pretended not to listen. Dad shifted uncomfortably before finally saying words that sounded almost physically painful for him. "People around town seem pretty impressed. Not 'I'm proud of you.' Not even congratulations. Just, people seem impressed." I almost smiled at how predictable it was. "Town always did like headlines," I answered calmly. Danny laughed too loudly. "Well, you're basically famous now. Mom's been saving newspapers like you're a Kennedy." Mom shot him a look. The room filled with uncomfortable chuckles. Then Aunt Linda walked over carrying deviled eggs and touched my arm. "Your grandmother always said you were destined for something important." There it was again. Grandma Eleanor. The only person whose faith in me never changed with public opinion. I looked around the crowded living room. Football game playing softly on television. Cheap folding chairs pulled from the garage. Pot roast smell drifting from the kitchen. Middle-aged relatives suddenly eager to hear Pentagon stories after years of barely asking about my life. And right then I understood something clearly. They didn't know me at all. Not really. They knew the newspaper version. The impressive version. The version validated by strangers. But nobody in this room knew how many nights I cried alone after deployments. How many holidays I spent eating microwave dinners on base. How hard I worked to become someone my father still couldn't quite say he respected. Then the front door opened again. Cold air swept inside, and when I saw who stepped through that doorway holding an old leather satchel in his weathered hands, my heart nearly stopped. Captain Harold Bennett, Grandma Eleanor's old Army medic partner, 82 years old and still standing straight. The entire room turned toward him in confusion. But I already knew. This was the real reason I came home. And suddenly my family had no idea what was about to walk into that living room. Captain Harold Bennett removed his wool coat, slowly, carefully folding it over one arm, while the entire living room stared at him. Nobody in my family recognized him except me. But the second I saw the old Army Corps pin on his lapel, I felt 16 years old again, sitting at Grandma Eleanor's kitchen table, listening to stories about soldiers who never came home. Harold looked older than the last time I'd seen him at my promotion ceremony. Thinner, too, but his eyes were still sharp. "Rebecca," he said warmly. I crossed the room before anybody else could speak and hugged him tightly. "I didn't know you were coming." He smiled faintly. "Your grandmother taught me surprises matter." That got my father's attention immediately. "Harold Bennett," Dad asked cautiously. "From Eleanor's old stories." Harold nodded once. "That's right." Dad shook his hand with visible uncertainty. Now here's the thing about men from my father's generation, especially working-class Midwestern men. Military service meant something sacred to them even if they rarely talked about emotions. A veteran from Korea automatically carried weight in a room like this, which meant Harold's presence changed the atmosphere immediately. The joking stopped. The performance softened. Mom hurried to make coffee while Harold settled slowly into Dad's old recliner near the fireplace. "You look just like your grandmother around the eyes," he told me quietly. I swallowed hard. Nobody had said that to me since her funeral. The room eventually reorganized itself into awkward conversation. Cousins wandered toward the kitchen. The football game kept playing in the background. Somebody dropped ice into glasses. But underneath it all, tension hummed quietly. Because everybody sensed Harold hadn't come just for dinner. He brought something with him. The old leather satchel rested against his chair the entire time. Dad noticed it too. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes of shallow small talk about traffic, weather, and Washington politics, Harold cleared his throat. "I came because Eleanor asked me to." The room went completely still. My mother blinked. "Asked you to?" Harold nodded slowly. "Before she passed." Dad frowned. That was 3 years ago. She knew her time was running out. I felt cold suddenly. Harold rested both hands on the satchel. "She gave me instructions. Told me there would come a day Rebecca finally came home after proving herself to people who never fully saw her." Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for coffee. And for the first time all evening, my father looked genuinely uncomfortable. Harold opened the satchel carefully and removed a worn black journal tied with faded blue ribbon. I recognized it instantly. Grandma Eleanor's handwriting covered the front. Dad stared at it in confusion. "I've never seen that before." "No," Harold answered quietly, "because she kept it private." He looked toward me. "She wrote in it for almost 20 years. The room suddenly felt too small. Harold untied the ribbon slowly. "Eleanor asked me to give this to Rebecca one day, but only after the family was finally willing to listen." Danny shifted awkwardly on the couch. "Listen to what?" Harold opened the journal and adjusted his glasses. Then he began reading. "March 14th, 2004, he said softly. "Frank thinks Rebecca is too quiet for this world. He worries quiet people get ignored. What he doesn't understand is that quiet people often survive things loud people never could." My throat tightened instantly. Mom lowered her eyes. Harold turned another page. "Rebecca sat with me tonight polishing old service shoes. She asks thoughtful questions, notices details. That girl carries loneliness in her chest like a grown woman already." I couldn't breathe properly. Because suddenly Grandma's voice existed in the room again. Warm, steady, certain, Harold continued. "I fear Rebecca spends her whole life trying to earn affection that should have been given freely." Dad looked down at the carpet. Danny folded his arms defensively. Nobody interrupted. Outside, wind rattled dry leaves across the porch. Harold read another passage. "Frank praises confidence because he understands confidence. But Rebecca's strength is different. Hers is endurance." That sentence nearly broke me. Because somebody had finally named it correctly. My entire life wasn't built on brilliance or charm or attention. It was built on endurance. Harold paused and looked at my father. "She loved you very much, Frank, but she worried about the things you couldn't say." Dad rubbed his jaw uncomfortably. "I did my best." Harold nodded gently. "I know you believe that." That answer landed harder than an accusation would have. The room stayed silent another moment before Danny finally spoke. "So what this is all supposed to make us feel guilty?" I looked at my brother carefully. He sounded irritated, but underneath it I heard something else. Fear. Harold closed the journal halfway. "No, Eleanor hated guilt. She believed guilt without growth is useless." Danny scoffed softly. "Then why now?" Harold looked directly at him. "Because your sister spent 20 years becoming someone this family should have appreciated long before strangers did." Nobody spoke after that. Not even Danny. The football commentators droned softly from the television while the weight of Harold's words settled across the room like snowfall. And sitting there surrounded by relatives, I realized something painful. I'd spent most of my life thinking success would finally heal old wounds. That enough promotions, accomplishments, or recognition would eventually make my father look at me differently. But sitting there now, I understood the truth. Success doesn't erase childhood hurt. It just changes who witnesses it. Harold opened the journal again. "One more thing," he said quietly. He reached into the satchel and removed an old envelope with my name written across the front in Eleanor's careful handwriting. My hands trembled immediately. Dad stared at it. "When did she write that?" 2 weeks before she died. Harold handed it to me gently. "She told me Rebecca would need it someday after the world finally noticed her, but before bitterness hardened permanently inside her." The room disappeared around me. All I could see was Grandma's handwriting. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single folded page. I recognized the scent instantly. Lavender. Her old perfume. My vision blurred before I even started reading. And then I saw the first line. If you're reading this, sweetheart, it means they finally see what I always did. I had to stop. My chest hurt too badly. Mom quietly began crying near the kitchen doorway. Dad still hadn't spoken. Not once. Harold leaned back slowly and folded his weathered hands. Then, in the gentlest voice imaginable, he said the words that changed the entire night. Frank, your daughter didn't become extraordinary because the world praised her. He looked directly at my father. She became extraordinary because she learned how to survive without it. Nobody moved for several seconds after Harold said those words. The football game kept playing softly in the background, but nobody was watching anymore. My father sat in his recliner staring at the carpet with both hands locked together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I'd seen Frank Whitmore angry 1,000 times in my life, seen him sarcastic, dismissive, proud, but never uncertain. This looked different, older somehow, like a man slowly realizing memory might not tell the same story as truth. Mom finally wiped her eyes with a napkin and tried to steady herself. Maybe we should eat, she whispered. That's what people from our generation of families do when emotions become too large. They feed everybody. So plates started moving around the dining room table. Pot roast. Mashed potatoes. Green beans cooked too long the way my father liked them. The normalcy almost felt absurd after everything Harold had read aloud. But I appreciated it too. Because real American families rarely heal through dramatic speeches. Most healing happens while somebody passes gravy quietly and avoids eye contact. I sat beside Harold while Danny poured himself bourbon 2 fingers too heavy. That alone told me he was rattled. Danny only drank like that when life stopped behaving predictably. Across the table, Dad finally looked toward me. You never said Harold was still around. I kept my tone calm. You never asked. The words landed harder than I intended. Dad lowered his eyes immediately. Mom jumped in quickly. Your father didn't mean... I know what he meant, I answered gently. And I did. That was the problem. Nobody at that table was cruel in the cartoon villain way people imagine when they hear stories like mine. My parents paid bills, showed up for emergencies, made sure we had food. Dad worked overtime most of his adult life. Mom packed lunches and folded laundry and drove us to dentist appointments. From the outside, we looked like a perfectly decent American family. But emotional neglect rarely looks dramatic from the street. It looks ordinary. That's why people miss it for years. Dinner moved awkwardly at first. Silverware scraping plates, small talk trying desperately to survive. Finally, Danny leaned back in his chair and exhaled loudly. So, what exactly do you do over there, he asked me, at the Pentagon? I almost laughed. Because in 38 years, my brother had never once shown genuine curiosity about my career until strangers started admiring it. Mostly coordination work, I said. Danny smirked faintly. That newspaper made it sound pretty important. Harold glanced at him carefully. Some work matters even when nobody sees it. Danny took another sip of bourbon. Well, apparently everybody sees it now. There it was again, that edge in his voice. The resentment. I studied my brother quietly. Danny had once been handsome in the easy hometown way. Broad shoulders, thick hair, big personality. But stress changes people. His face looked puffier now. His smile strained at the corners. And for the first time in my life, I realized Danny wasn't actually happy. Not truly. He'd spent decades playing the role everybody expected from him. Golden son. Local success story. Family man. But something underneath had started cracking. Dad cleared his throat suddenly. Business still giving you trouble? Danny stiffened immediately. There's no trouble. Mom and Dad exchanged a quick glance. So there it was. The thing nobody was discussing openly. I leaned back quietly and let the silence stretch. Eventually, Danny shrugged. Economy's rough right now. What happened? I asked carefully. Danny hesitated. Then he laughed bitterly. What happened is people stopped buying things they don't need. Turns out Danny's construction supply company had been bleeding money for over a year. Rising fuel costs, bad loans. 2 commercial clients who never paid invoices. He'd hidden most of it from the family while trying to maintain appearances. But small-town reputations can become prisons. Once everybody thinks you're successful, admitting failure starts feeling impossible. Dad stared down at his plate. I offered to help. Danny's jaw tightened. I don't need rescuing. The irony nearly overwhelmed me. My whole life, Danny had been the one celebrated for staying local and building something real. Meanwhile, I was the unrealistic daughter chasing military paperwork. And now here we sat. Me financially stable but emotionally exhausted. Danny emotionally defensive and financially drowning. Funny how life rearranges assumptions with age. Harold quietly sipped coffee before speaking again. Eleanor used to worry about both of you kids. Mom looked surprised. Both. Harold nodded. She worried Rebecca would feel unseen, and she worried Danny would become trapped trying to stay admired. Danny looked away immediately. Because even now at 42 years old, my brother still lived like the town's opinion-controlled oxygen itself. The conversation drifted after that. People started discussing old neighbors, factory closures, church gossip. But underneath everything, tension kept simmering. Finally, Dad stood up slowly and walked toward the living room window. Snow had started falling lightly outside, tiny flakes drifting beneath the porch light. Without turning around, he spoke quietly. You know what the hardest thing about getting old is? Nobody answered. Dad folded his arms. You spend your whole life thinking you understand people. He paused. Then one day, you realize you missed important things sitting right in front of you. The room went silent again. Mom stared at him like she'd never heard him speak this honestly before. Dad still faced the window. When Rebecca was little, she never asked for much. His voice roughened slightly. I thought quiet meant strong. My chest tightened. And maybe sometimes he continued quiet means lonely. Nobody moved. Harold lowered his eyes respectfully. Danny rubbed his forehead hard with one hand. And me! I felt anger and sadness colliding together so hard I couldn't separate them anymore. Because this was all I ever wanted. Not applause. Not headlines. Not Pentagon articles. Just acknowledgement. Simple acknowledgement that my feelings had existed all along. Dad finally turned toward me. I read that article 3 times before I recognized you. That sentence hurt more than the original insult ever had. Because buried inside it was the truth. The world had introduced my father to his own daughter. He walked back toward the table slowly. Then, after a long silence, he asked the question I never expected him to ask. Rebecca, were we really that hard on you? The room held its breath. I looked at my father carefully. Really looked at him. Not the giant figure from childhood. Just an aging man carrying mistakes he didn't fully understand until too late. And for the first time in my life, I decided not to protect him from the answer. Yes, I said quietly. Nobody spoke after that. Outside, snow continued falling over Maplewood. And deep down, I think every person in that house understood the real family meeting had finally begun. After Dad admitted it, nobody at the table seemed to know what came next. That's the thing people don't tell you about long-awaited moments. Truth doesn't arrive with music playing in the background. Sometimes it just sits there awkwardly beside the mashed potatoes while everybody avoids looking directly at each other. Mom eventually stood and began clearing dishes with trembling hands. I'll make coffee, she whispered again, even though there was already coffee sitting untouched on the counter. Danny disappeared onto the back porch with his bourbon. And Dad stayed, standing beside the dining room table, staring at me like he was trying to reconcile 2 different versions of his daughter at the same time. The little quiet girl from Maplewood, and the woman from the Pentagon newspaper article. Harold broke the silence first. Frank, he said gently, why don't you tell her the truth? Dad frowned slightly. I already did. No, Harold answered calmly. You admitted regret. That's different from truth. Dad's jaw tightened. Men from my father's generation weren't taught how to unpack emotions. They were taught how to survive layoffs, fix engines, and ignore chest pain until somebody forced them to see a doctor. Emotional language always sounded foreign coming from him. But Harold waited patiently. Finally, Dad sat down heavily in his chair. And for the first time in my entire life, my father spoke to me without sounding like he was trying to win something. When you were little, he began slowly, you scared me. I blinked in surprise. Me? Dad nodded. You noticed everything. Nobody had ever said that to me before. He rubbed his rough hands together while searching for words. Danny was easy, loud kid, tough kid. If he got hurt, he yelled. If he wanted something, he asked. He looked up at me carefully. You just got quiet. I swallowed hard. Dad exhaled slowly. When your grandmother died, she told me something at the hospital I never forgot. He paused. Frank, one day you're gonna realize your daughter stopped bringing her feelings to you because you kept teaching her they were inconvenient. Mom froze near the kitchen counter. Apparently she'd never heard that either. Dad stared at the table. I got angry at Eleanor for saying it. His voice cracked slightly. But after you left for Annapolis, the house changed. I leaned forward slightly despite myself. How? He gave a sad little laugh. Too quiet. That nearly broke me. Because all those years I thought nobody noticed my absence. But apparently they did. They just noticed too late. Dad shook his head slowly. You stopped calling as much after the academy. I got busy. No, he said quietly. You got careful. The room fell silent again. And he was right. By my mid-20s, every conversation with home became emotionally measured. Safe topics only. Weather, travel, schedules. Never disappointment. Never loneliness. Never the ache of constantly feeling emotionally optional inside your own family. Harold leaned back in his chair, watching both of us carefully. Eleanor always believed families survive through honesty, he said. Danny suddenly walked back inside from the porch. Well, honesty's easy for dead people, he muttered. Mom immediately frowned. Danny! No, seriously, he continued, dropping into his chair again. Everybody's acting like Becca had this horrible childhood. I looked at him calmly. I never said horrible. But that's what everybody's implying. His face flushed red now, bourbon sharpening his emotions. We had food, Christmases, vacations sometimes. Dad worked himself half to death for us. I know that. So what exactly are we apologizing for? There it was, the question hanging over the whole night. What counts as damage when nobody hit you? I folded my hands together carefully. Do you remember my high school graduation? I asked him. Danny shrugged. Sure. Dad missed it because your baseball tournament got rescheduled. Danny rolled his eyes slightly. That was one thing. It was a lot of things. He opened his mouth again, but I kept going. When I got accepted into Annapolis, Dad told neighbors he hoped I'd grow out of military fantasies. Danny shifted uncomfortably. When I made lieutenant, nobody came to the ceremony. Mom whispered softly, we couldn't afford the travel. I looked at her gently. You flew to Cancun for Danny's anniversary 2 years later. That one landed hard. Mom sat down slowly after that. Danny rubbed his forehead. You're keeping score now. No, I answered quietly. I'm explaining why I stopped expecting support. The room went still again. And then unexpectedly Dad spoke. She's right. Danny turned toward him immediately. Dad. No, Dad shook his head. She's right. Hearing my father say that out loud felt surreal. He looked exhausted now. Older than I'd ever seen him. I spent years thinking toughness meant treating everybody the same, he said. But kids aren't the same. Danny needed pushing. Rebecca needed encouragement. I felt tears threatening finally. Not because the pain disappeared, but because somebody was finally naming it correctly. Dad stared at me across the table. You know the worst part. I said nothing. I thought I was preparing you for disappointment. His voice roughened. Turns out I became the disappointment. Nobody moved. Even Danny stayed quiet after that. Then Harold reached into his satchel again. There's something else Eleanor wanted Rebecca to have. He removed a small stack of papers clipped together. Old documents, typed forms, letters. I frowned in confusion. What is that? Harold smiled faintly. Your scholarship application. I blinked. My what? The military scholarship that helped pay for your academy preparation program. I stared at him. I thought the foundation selected me. They did. Harold nodded. But Eleanor recommended you. The room froze. Dad looked stunned. Eleanor did what? Harold handed me the papers. She contacted former service connections quietly, told them her granddaughter had discipline, intelligence, and grit. My hands trembled, turning the pages. There it was. Grandma's signature. Letters of recommendation. Handwritten notes praising me in ways nobody else ever had. She never told me, I whispered. She didn't want you feeling indebted, Harold answered. She wanted you believing you earned it. My vision blurred again. All these years, Grandma had been protecting my future behind the scenes while I thought I climbed alone. Dad suddenly covered his eyes with one hand. And when he finally spoke, his voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. She believed in you more than I did. I looked at my father quietly. Then I answered with the deepest truth I knew. She had practiced seeing people clearly. The next morning, I woke before sunrise in my old childhood bedroom. For a moment, lying there under the faded quilt my mother had sewn sometime in the early 90s, I forgot where I was. Then I heard the furnace rattling through the walls, smelled coffee downstairs, and remembered everything. The family meeting, Grandma's journal, Dad admitting the truth. I stared at the ceiling for a long time before getting up. Outside the window, fresh snow covered Maplewood in soft white silence. The whole town looked gentler after snowfall, cleaner somehow. Funny how winter can make even old pain seem quieter for a few hours. I pulled on jeans and a sweater and walked downstairs expecting tension. Instead, I found my father alone at the kitchen table. No television. No newspaper. just coffee cooling beside his hands. He looked up when I entered. Morning. Morning. For years, conversations between us had always felt crowded with invisible things. Expectations, defensiveness, old disappointments stacked like furniture nobody wanted to move. But this morning felt different. Still uncomfortable. Still fragile. But honest. Dad gestured toward the coffee pot. Fresh if you want some. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him carefully. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Dad cleared his throat. Couldn't sleep much. Me neither. He nodded like that made sense. Because maybe it did. Some truths rearrange your entire memory overnight. Finally, he looked at me directly. You really paid for most of your grandmother's funeral. There it was. One of the many quiet facts nobody ever asked about. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly. Danny was struggling financially back then. That's not what I asked. I met his eyes. Yes. Dad leaned back heavily in his chair. I didn't know. And for once I believed him. Not because he never could have known, but because nobody in this family had trained themselves to notice my sacrifices. I'd become too self-sufficient for my own good. That happens to a lot of women from my generation. You get praised for handling everything alone long enough that people stop imagining you might need help too. Dad rubbed his jaw slowly. Your mother told me you flew home 3 times while Eleanor was sick. I had leave saved up. You never mentioned how hard that was. I almost smiled sadly. You never asked. He nodded once like a man accepting a sentence he couldn't appeal. The kitchen clock ticked softly between us. Finally, Dad said something that surprised me. I used to think your grandmother spoiled you. I raised an eyebrow. She taught me discipline. She taught you confidence, he corrected quietly. And I didn't understand it. He stared down into his coffee. My father believed praise made people weak. There it was again. The inheritance nobody talks about enough. Not money. Not land. Emotional habits. Frank Whitmore had spent his entire life repeating lessons he never consciously chose. And somewhere along the way he'd mistaken emotional distance for strength. Dad exhaled slowly. When you were little, every time you cried, I thought I was supposed to toughen you up. My throat tightened instantly. You know what Eleanor told me once, he continued. Frank, not every child needs hardening. Some already carry too much inside them. I looked away toward the frosted kitchen window before tears could form. Because Grandma had understood me before I understood myself. The back door suddenly opened. Danny walked in wearing his old work jacket and carrying the smell of cold air with him. He looked exhausted. Like he hadn't slept at all. Morning, he muttered. Dad nodded. Danny grabbed coffee, then stood awkwardly near the counter before finally speaking. I got a call from the bank. Dad's expression darkened immediately. How bad? Danny laughed humorlessly. They're giving me 60 days. The room fell silent. He stared into his cup. I might lose the warehouse. For years, Danny had been the family success story. Local business owner. High school sports legend. The son who stayed. And suddenly he looked just as frightened as I'd felt at 22 sitting alone in military housing during my first deployment. Different circumstances. Same loneliness. Dad stood slowly. We'll figure something out. Danny shook his head immediately. No, I'm done pretending I've got everything handled. That surprised me more than anything. Because pride runs deep in families like ours. Especially among men. Danny finally looked directly at me. You want to know something awful? I stayed quiet. I hated that newspaper article. The honesty in his voice stunned the room. Danny laughed bitterly. Everybody in town suddenly talking about my little sister like she's some hero. He rubbed his forehead. And all I could think was, when did she become the successful one? Dad frowned sharply. Danny. No, let him talk, I said quietly. Danny swallowed hard. You escaped this place. His eyes reddened slightly. I stayed because everybody said I was the one who'd build something here. Nobody interrupted. Then your picture ends up in the paper looking important as hell while my business is falling apart. And there it was. Not hatred. Not cruelty. Just shame. Ugly, ordinary shame. The kind that quietly poisons families for years. Danny sat down heavily across from me. I kept waiting for you to fail, he admitted softly. Because if you failed too, then maybe staying here wouldn't feel like such a mistake. The room went completely still. I looked at my brother carefully, and for the first time in decades I saw him clearly too. Not the golden child. Not Dad's favorite. Just another aging person terrified his life hadn't become what he promised himself it would. Mom entered the kitchen halfway through the silence and immediately sensed the emotional wreckage in the room. What happened? Dad answered quietly. We finally stopped lying. Mom sat slowly beside him. Nobody spoke for nearly a full minute. Then I reached into my coat pocket and removed Grandma Eleanor's old Army service pin. I placed it carefully in the center of the kitchen table. Everybody stared at it. She used to tell me something before every deployment, I said softly. Dad looked at the pin like it carried her ghost. What? I took a slow breath. She said strength isn't measured by how long you hide pain. My voice trembled slightly. It's measured by what you choose to do after pain changes you. Nobody moved. Outside church bells rang softly somewhere across snow-covered Maplewood. And sitting there in my childhood kitchen beside the family that once made me feel invisible, I finally realized something unexpected. I didn't come home for revenge anymore. I came home because Grandma Eleanor spent her whole life teaching me not to become bitter. And now it was finally time to show my family what she left behind. 3 months later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony happened on a cold Saturday morning under a gray Ohio sky. The new sign outside the renovated brick building read, Eleanor Whitmore Veterans Resource Center. Simple, no giant flags, no dramatic slogans, just her name, exactly the way Grandma would have wanted it. I stood near the entrance, adjusting my gloves while volunteers carried folding chairs through the front doors. Across the parking lot, local veterans gathered slowly beneath clouds of visible breath. Old Marines in worn jackets, Army widows holding coffee cups, Vietnam veterans with canes. Men who rarely talked about pain, but carried it everywhere anyway. Maplewood had more veterans than people realized. Small towns usually do. They just suffer quietly. That morning, for the first time in years, I felt Grandma Eleanor everywhere. In the cold air. In the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the lobby. In the careful way volunteers arranged donated winter coats near the counseling office. She believed service only mattered if it continued helping people after applause disappeared. And somehow, despite everything, we had managed to build something worthy of her name. Harold stood beside me wearing his old army overcoat and a dark wool scarf. You nervous? He asked. A little. He smiled faintly. Good, means you care. The center itself had once been an abandoned insurance office near downtown Maplewood, empty for almost 7 years. Now it held grief counseling rooms, benefit assistance offices, transportation scheduling for elderly veterans, and weekly support meetings for military spouses and widows. Nothing glamorous. Just practical help. The kind Grandma respected most. Dad arrived early carrying 2 boxes of donated blankets from church. That alone would have shocked the old version of me. Frank Whitmore volunteering publicly for something emotional. Impossible 6 months ago. But people can soften if life humbles them enough. He set the boxes down near the lobby and glanced around quietly. Looks good. I smiled slightly. Thank you. Dad shoved his hands into his coat pockets awkwardly. Then he nodded toward the sign outside. Your grandmother would have liked this better than statues or speeches. She hated speeches. Dad chuckled softly. She hated long speeches. That tiny moment standing together joking gently about Grandma healed more in me than some dramatic apology ever could. Danny arrived next, carrying trays of pastries from the local bakery. His business still wasn't fully stable, but something inside him had changed after that night in the kitchen. He looked lighter now, less defensive. Turns out honesty exhausts people at first, but eventually it frees them. Coffee guy canceled, he announced, so I brought extra pastries to distract everybody. Mom rolled her eyes affectionately. There are enough cinnamon rolls here to feed a football stadium. Danny shrugged. Trauma response. Even Dad laughed at that. And hearing my father laugh with both his children instead of comparing us felt strangely unfamiliar. Beautiful, but unfamiliar. By 10 o'clock, nearly 80 people had gathered inside and outside the center. Far more than expected. Town council members, veterans groups, church families, even people who barely knew us personally. Because in towns like Maplewood, once somebody finally starts helping quietly suffering people, word spreads fast. A local reporter approached me near the entrance. Commander Whitmore, she began politely what inspired this project. I paused before answering. Then I looked toward the sign carrying Grandma Eleanor's name. My grandmother taught me something important, I said. A lot of people survive wars and spend the rest of their lives pretending they didn't bring any of it home with them. The reporter lowered her notebook slightly. And this center, this place gives people permission to stop pretending. She nodded slowly after that. No flashy quote needed. Just truth. A little before the ceremony began, Harold asked everyone to gather near the front entrance. Snow flurries drifted lightly around us while folding chairs scraped against pavement. Then Harold stepped forward carefully, holding a small note card in trembling hands. At 82 years old, his voice still carried quiet authority. "I served beside Eleanor Whitmore during Korea," he began, "and I can tell you something with certainty." The crowd grew still. She never cared about status, never cared about recognition. She cared about whether people felt abandoned. Dad lowered his eyes immediately. Harold continued, "She once told me the loneliest people in America are often the ones everybody assumes are doing fine." That line hit hard across the crowd, because older Americans understand that kind of loneliness deeply. Harold looked toward me then. "Rebecca built this center because she understands service isn't about revenge against people who doubted you." He smiled softly. "It's about becoming strong enough to help anyway." I felt my throat tighten immediately. Then Harold stepped aside and gestured for my father to come forward. Dad looked genuinely startled. "I'm not giving a speech." Harold smiled. "Yes, you are." The crowd chuckled lightly. Dad looked trapped for a moment. Then slowly, very slowly, Frank Whitmore walked toward the microphone. I honestly don't think I'd ever seen him nervous before. He stared out at the crowd while cold wind moved across the parking lot. Finally, he cleared his throat. "My daughter spent most of her life believing this family didn't see her clearly." The entire crowd fell silent. Dad's voice roughened slightly. "And the painful thing is, she was right." Mom quietly wiped tears beside Danny. Dad shook his head once. "I thought strength meant criticizing people until they got tougher." He glanced toward me. "Turns out encouragement works a whole lot better." A few people laughed softly through emotion. Dad swallowed hard. "I spent years waiting for Rebecca to become someone impressive." His eyes reddened slightly. "What I missed was the fact she already was. That did it. That finally broke me. Not because the pain disappeared. Not because the past changed. But because after 38 years my father finally saw me without needing the world's permission first." Dad looked out at the crowd one last time. "If you still have children who speak to you," he said quietly, "don't wait for newspaper headlines before you tell them you're proud." Nobody clapped immediately. The silence mattered more. Then slowly people began applauding. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Just honestly. And standing there beneath falling snow outside the Veterans Center built in Grandma Eleanor's memory, I realized something she'd understood all along. Revenge might satisfy wounded pride for a little while, but healing changes entire families. Later that evening, after everybody left and the lights dimmed inside the center, Dad and I stood alone near the front entrance watching snow collect across Maplewood. He looked older now. Softer, too. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he said quietly. I slipped Grandma Eleanor's service pin back into my coat pocket. Then I looked at my father and answered honestly, "You still made it before it was too late." If this story touched something in your heart, maybe reminded you of your own family, your own parents, your own children, take a moment tonight to tell somebody what they mean to you while you still can. Sometimes people spend their whole lives waiting to feel seen, and sometimes one honest sentence can heal wounds carried for decades. "Thank you for spending this time with me." The first thing my father said after I answered the phone was, "The bank's taking the house." "What did you do?" His voice was sharp with panic, stripped of the cold authority he had used on me my whole life. In the background, I could hear my mother crying. Papers rustled. A television blared somewhere in the house. I remember smiling. Not because I was happy. Not because revenge had ever been something I dreamed about. But because for the first time in 42 years, Frank Reeves sounded afraid, and I wasn't the one standing there shaking. I quietly ended the call. Then I looked through the window of my motel room at the gray Virginia morning and let myself remember how all of it had started. It had begun exactly 1 week earlier. At 5:03 on a Monday morning, someone started pounding on my apartment door hard enough to rattle the brass unit number screwed into the frame. I woke instantly. 20 years in Army intelligence teaches you to wake fast. For a moment I thought I was back in Afghanistan, half asleep in a plywood bunk, while incoming alarms screamed through the dark. My heart slammed against my ribs before my mind caught up with where I was. Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Officer housing. Stateside. Safe. Then the pounding came again. Major Reeves Military Police, open the door. I was already out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. My apartment was neat, everything exactly where it belonged. Habit, discipline, order had shaped my life for more than 2 decades. I threw on a robe and opened the door. 2 MPs stood there in full uniform. Behind them was a man in civilian clothes holding a leather folder. The older MP avoided my eyes. That was my first warning. The civilian introduced himself as Special Agent Thomas Keating with Army Criminal Investigation Division. "Major Abigail Reeves," he said, his voice clipped and formal, "you are being placed under immediate administrative suspension, pending investigation into unauthorized access and transfer of classified financial intelligence records." For a moment, the words didn't register. Unauthorized access. Transfer. I stared at him. There has to be some mistake. I'm afraid not. He handed me papers. Legal language blurred across the page. My security clearance was suspended effective immediately. My command authority was revoked pending investigation. I was prohibited from entering secure facilities or accessing military systems. It felt unreal, like hearing details from someone else's life. I had spent 21 years building my career. West Point. 2 overseas tours? Bronze Star. Countless nights under fluorescent lights tracking financial trails through hostile networks. And now some stranger was standing in my doorway dismantling all of it before sunrise. "I want my JAG representative." "You'll have one by 800. The younger MP shifted uncomfortably. He knew me. I recognized him too, Private Morales, fresh-faced kid from Texas. I'd once helped him get emergency leave when his father had a stroke. Now he stood there while another man confiscated my government-issued laptop and credentials. That was how quickly dignity can vanish. By 6:30, the rumors had already started. Military communities are small. News moves faster than wildfire. By 7, I had 3 texts from officers asking if the allegations were true. By 8, silence. No one wants proximity to disgrace. I sat in my apartment until 10, staring at my blank television screen. Then I did the one thing I hadn't done in years. I drove to my parents' house. They lived in Columbia, Maryland, in the same neat colonial home where I'd grown up. White shutters, blue hydrangeas, American flag hanging proudly from the porch. Frank Reeves believed deeply in appearances. A polished lawn meant discipline. Pressed shirts meant respectability. Children who succeeded reflected well on their parents. Children who stumbled were an embarrassment to be corrected. I had spent most of my life trying to earn his approval. Even West Point hadn't fully done it. He'd shaken my hand at graduation and said, "Not bad." That was the closest thing to pride I'd ever received. I pulled into their driveway just after noon. For a second, sitting there with my hands gripping the wheel, I was 16 again, hoping home would feel safe. I rang the bell. My mother answered. Elaine Reeves looked smaller than I remembered. Softer somehow, her silver hair pinned neatly back. The moment she saw my face, her expression changed. Fear. Not concern. Fear. "Abby." "Mom, I need to talk to Dad." She hesitated. Then my father appeared behind her. Frank Reeves looked exactly as he always had, straight-backed iron gray hair, crisp button-down shirt tucked neatly into pressed slacks. Even retired, he dressed like the world was watching. His eyes landed on me, then narrowed. I saw the news. It isn't true. Military police don't show up for innocent people. I stared at him. "Dad, I'm being framed." He folded his arms. "You've brought enough shame to this family." The words landed harder than I expected. My mother looked down. Not defending me. Not saying my name. Just looking down. Then my father said the sentence I will never forget. "Don't drag our family name down with you." I laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "Are you serious?" Without answering, he stepped outside and dropped my old deployment duffel bag onto the porch. I stared at it. "What is this?" "We cleared out the things you left here." Confusion hit me first. Then dread. I reached for my phone and opened my banking app. Balance $413.72. I froze. Number. No. The account had held nearly $80,000. Savings from deployments. Combat pay. Years of careful planning for retirement. My father had co-signed emergency access years ago before my first deployment in case something happened overseas. I looked up at him, my pulse roaring in my ears. "You emptied my account." "We protected family assets from seizure." My mouth went dry. That was my money. It was under our family name. Then he looked me straight in the eye and said calm, as if discussing weather. "Never use our family name again." My mother began crying quietly behind him. But she said nothing. And somehow that hurt more. I picked up my duffel. No shouting. No pleading. Military training teaches control. So I turned and walked back to my car. I drove south until Marilyn disappeared in the rearview mirror. By nightfall, I checked into a roadside motel off I-95 with faded floral bedspreads and humming fluorescent lights. And for the first time since I was 18 years old, I had nowhere to go. That was the night I realized something harder than betrayal. Sometimes the people who abandon you were never really standing with you at all. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. That smell stayed with me all week. Even now, months later, I sometimes catch a trace of disinfectant in a hospital hallway or an airport restroom, and I'm right back there sitting on the edge of that sagging mattress with my army duffel at my feet, staring at a future that had gone blank overnight. The first morning after my parents threw me out, I woke before dawn out of habit. For 21 years, Reveille had been my clock, whether I was stationed in Virginia, South Korea, or halfway across a desert under blackout conditions. My body still expected purpose at 0500. Instead, there was only silence. No command schedule. No secure briefings. No morning reports waiting in my inbox. Just the buzz of the motel's ancient air conditioner and the sick feeling that my life had been paused by someone else's hand. I sat up slowly and reached for my phone. Nothing. No messages from command. No texts from colleagues. No calls from my parents. The isolation felt surgical, as if every thread connecting me to the world had been cut cleanly at once. For a while, I simply sat there and listened to the traffic passing on Interstate 95 beyond the window. Then discipline took over. I showered. Pressed my civilian clothes as neatly as I could. Made the bed. Small things. Order is often the only defense against panic. At 800 sharp, my temporary legal liaison called. Captain Laura Kim, Judge Advocate General's Corps. Her voice was professional but kind. "Major Reeves, I've reviewed the preliminary allegations." And a pause. "This is unusual." That got my attention. How unusual. "The access logs show your credentials authorized financial intelligence transfers at 02:17 hours last Thursday. I was asleep in my quarters. I know, base access logs confirm you never left your apartment." A quiet tension entered her voice. Someone either cloned your credentials or they had elevated system override access. I sat straighter. Which means this wasn't random. Number. For the first time since the MPS had appeared at my door, my fear sharpened into focus. I had spent years tracking financial fraud through military contracting systems. If someone had used my credentials to move classified financial records, they either wanted money or they wanted me blamed for finding something I shouldn't have. Laura's voice lowered. Officially, I shouldn't say more, but unofficially, Major, this smells wrong. After we hung up, I stared at the wall for a long time. Then I opened my notebook. Paper, pen, old school. When systems are compromised, analog survives. I began writing every case I'd touched in the last 6 months. Defense vendors. Logistics contractors. Supply chain discrepancies. Payment irregularities. Halfway down page 3, one name stopped me cold. Redstone Federal Logistics. 3 months earlier, I had flagged unusual transaction layering through their overseas subcontractors. Nothing dramatic at first glance, just enough inconsistency to suggest laundering if someone knew where to look. I had submitted a recommendation for expanded audit review. 2 days later, I'd been told higher command would handle it. Then silence. Now I was under investigation. My instincts stirred. This wasn't coincidence. At noon, there was a knock at my motel door. Every muscle tightened. When I opened it, Colonel Daniel Mercer stood there holding 2 coffees. Retired 3 years now, Mercer had once been my commanding officer and the closest thing I'd ever had to a professional father. Tall and broad even in his 60s, with silver hair cropped short and eyes that missed nothing, he looked exactly as he had the day he pinned my oak leaves on my uniform. "You look terrible," he said. I almost laughed. That obvious? Abigail, I've interrogated cartel financiers with better posture. That made me smile despite myself. He handed me coffee and stepped inside. We sat by the window while morning traffic hissed past outside. He listened while I told him everything. The MPs. My parents. The missing money. Redstone. When I finished, he was quiet. Then he nodded slowly. I was afraid of this. My stomach tightened. You know something? Not enough to prove anything. He folded his hands. 3 weeks ago, a friend at the Pentagon called me. Internal oversight had concerns about procurement fraud tied to Redstone and several shell contractors. I felt my pulse quicken. How high does it go? High enough that if you got close to exposing it, someone would notice. The room felt smaller. You think I was set up? I think someone with system-level access used your credentials because they knew your audit flags would make you believable. He leaned forward. Listen carefully, Abigail. Truth in Washington moves slow, but it always leaves footprints. That sentence settled into me like an anchor. For the first time all week, I could breathe. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't disgraced. I was inconvenient. And inconvenient people get erased if they stop paying attention. After Mercer left, I worked. Not officially. Not on any military system. But I knew enough about contractor reporting structures to map likely shell pathways by hand. Hours passed. Outside daylight faded to dusk. Around 7, my phone buzzed. Dad. I stared at his name. Frank Reeves had not called once to ask if I was safe. Not once. Now his name glowed across my screen like a command. I let it ring out. A minute later, voicemail. Then another call. Another voicemail. By midnight, there were 6. I didn't listen. Not yet. Instead, I sat by the motel window and watched headlights sweep across the parking lot. Somewhere out there, powerful people thought they had buried me. At the same time, somewhere north in Maryland, my father was calling with growing urgency. For reasons I didn't yet understand, both sides had suddenly remembered I existed. And experience had taught me one thing. When people who've ignored you suddenly need your attention, the truth is usually about to surface. I slept with my notebook open beside me. And for the first time since military police had pounded on my door, I dreamed not of losing everything, but of getting it back. The 7th call came at 6:14 the next morning. I was already awake, sitting at the little motel desk with my notebook open and a stale cup of coffee cooling beside me. Dawn was creeping through the thin curtains, laying pale stripes across the carpet. Dad's name flashed across my screen again. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered, "Hello." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to tell me he hadn't expected me to pick up. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded nothing like the cold, polished certainty I had grown up fearing. It was ragged. Panicked. Abigail. Not Abby. Not that clipped, dismissive tone he used whenever he wanted to remind me I'd disappointed him. My full name. Like he suddenly remembered I was a person. "What is it, Dad?" There was a sharp breath. Then he blurted, "The bank's taking the house." I said nothing. Behind him, I could hear my mother crying. Cabinet doors opening and closing. The low murmur of the television. Then his voice sharpened into accusation. "What did you do?" For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. Then memory clicked into place. 7 years earlier, right before my second deployment overseas, my parents had asked me to help them refinance. Dad had framed it as temporary, a smart financial adjustment while interest rates were favorable. "Just co-sign," he'd said. "It'll help secure approval. You've got stable military income." I had signed without hesitation. Because he was my father. Because family was supposed to mean trust. What I hadn't known, what I had never thought to check, was that after the refinance, he had quietly tied the mortgage autopay to the emergency account he had access to. My account. The account he had emptied the day he threw me out. The realization settled slowly. Heavy. Clean. The money that had kept their house afloat had been mine all along. And when he drained it to protect family assets, he'd severed his own lifeline. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the motel wall. On the other end, my father was breathing hard. "Well," he snapped. For most of my life, that tone would have sent adrenaline through me, the reflexive need to explain, obey, fix whatever he believed I had broken. But something inside me had shifted on that porch in Maryland. Some old chain had finally snapped. I smiled. Not cruelly. Not triumphantly. Just with the quiet recognition of truth finally arriving exactly where it belonged. Then I ended the call. No speech. No accusation. No explanation. Just silence. The phone buzzed again immediately. I muted it and set it face down. Outside, the Virginia sky was turning gold with sunrise. For the first time in days, I felt calm. Not vindicated. Not healed. Just clear. Some lessons don't need to be taught with anger. Reality usually handles that part just fine. I showered, dressed, and walked across the motel parking lot to the little diner next door. The waitress, a woman in her 60s named Sharon, had started recognizing me by then. She poured coffee before I even sat down. Rough week. I gave a tired smile. You could say that. She nodded like she understood more than she asked. That's something I've always admired about older Americans. The best of them know when kindness matters more than curiosity. I was halfway through my eggs when the television above the counter switched from local weather to national news. The headline froze me in place. Pentagon procurement fraud investigation expands. The anchor's voice sharpened. Sources inside the Department of Defense now confirm widening inquiries into financial irregularities tied to Redstone Federal Logistics and affiliated contractors. My pulse kicked. Sharon noticed. You okay, honey? I didn't answer. On-screen file footage rolled of Redstone executives entering a federal building. Then my own photograph appeared. My official army portrait. The diner went very still. The anchor continued. Earlier reports suggested Major Abigail Reeves was under investigation for unauthorized system access. New information indicates Reeves may instead be central to uncovering the fraud itself. The room blurred for a second. I gripped the edge of the booth. The anchor kept speaking. Military investigators are now examining evidence that Major Reeves's credentials were duplicated by senior systems administrators linked to contractor oversight offices. A man at the counter turned and stared at me. Recognition dawned. I stood slowly. Then my phone exploded with notifications. Texts. Voicemails. News alerts. 27 missed calls. Most from numbers I knew. Former colleagues. Reporters. And my parents. The phone rang again. Dad. I let it ring. Again. Again. Then voicemail. I listened. His voice had changed. Gone was the accusation. Gone was the command. Now there was something almost unrecognizable. Fear and shame. Abby, he said quietly, please call us back. We didn't know. I stared at the message long after it ended. Then Colonel Mercer called. His voice was steady. They've arrested 2 oversight officials and frozen Redstone assets. I closed my eyes. It's over. Not quite. A pause. Then warmth entered his tone. But your name's been cleared, Major, officially. For a moment I couldn't breathe. 21 years of service. A lifetime spent proving myself. And now, in one sentence, my honor had been returned. I thought I'd feel triumph. Instead, I felt grief. For the child who had spent decades chasing her father's approval. For the woman standing on that porch while her family turned her away. For all the years I had mistaken endurance for love. Mercer spoke again. You all right? I looked out the diner window at the brightening Virginia morning. And for the first time in my life I answered honestly. Yes. I think I finally am. By noon, every major news network in the country had my face on their screens. It was a strange thing watching your own army portrait appear beneath a chyron that read, Decorated Officer Cleared in Pentagon Fraud Case. I sat in the same diner booth where an hour earlier I had been a disgraced major hiding in plain sight. Now Sharon kept refilling my coffee while pretending not to stare. The regulars at the counter stole glances in my direction, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition to something like respect. I wasn't used to public attention. Military intelligence is built on invisibility. If people know your name, something has usually gone wrong. And for one long week, everything had. Now the truth was surfacing faster than anyone expected. The television anchor explained how investigators had uncovered an internal network of procurement fraud stretching through multiple oversight offices. Redstone Federal Logistics had funneled federal money through shell contractors for years. When I flagged irregularities in their overseas payment structures, 2 senior civilian administrators intercepted my audit requests. Then they cloned my credentials, falsified access logs, and used my profile as a scapegoat. The whole operation had nearly worked. Nearly. But one of the men they trusted, a systems analyst named Victor Salinas, had panicked after seeing how far they intended to push the cover-up. He had turned state's evidence before dawn. His testimony had broken everything open. By 11:30 that morning, federal agents had made arrests in Arlington and Washington. By noon, my suspension was formally lifted. At 12:14, my commanding general called personally. Lieutenant General Howard Whitaker was not a man known for softness. He had spent 37 years becoming exactly the kind of officer history books remember. His voice came through measured and precise. "Major Reeves." "Sir." A pause. Then, "You have my apology." The words landed harder than I expected. "I appreciate that, sir." "No," he said quietly, "you deserved better." I stared at the motel wallpaper while emotion tightened my throat. That was the thing about real leadership. It doesn't hide behind rank when it's wrong. Whitaker continued. "You'll report to Fort Belvoir at 800 tomorrow in full dress uniform. There will be a formal reinstatement and commendation." "Yes, sir." Another pause. Then his tone softened. "Well done, Major." The line clicked dead. For several moments I simply sat there holding the phone. 21 years of service had taught me that praise from men like Whitaker was rare and carefully earned. But all I felt was tired. Deep down tired. The kind that settles into your bones after surviving something your mind still hasn't caught up to. The next call came 3 minutes later. "Mom." I let it ring. Then voicemail. Her voice was shaking. "Abby, sweetheart, please call us. We were wrong. We didn't understand." A sob interrupted her. Then the message ended. I closed my eyes. The old ache rose instantly. That familiar pull to comfort her. To smooth over pain. To become the capable daughter who fixed everyone else's mistakes. But another voice, quieter and stronger, rose beside it. "You do not owe people immediate access just because they suddenly regret hurting you." That truth felt foreign. Almost rebellious. And yet it steadied me. The calls continued all afternoon. "Dad." "Mom." "Dad again." A text. "Please, we need to talk." Another. "The foreclosure notice was a mistake. There's more going on. Please call." I ignored them all. At 5 that evening, Colonel Mercer arrived at the motel. He wore jeans and a navy polo shirt, but somehow still looked like he was conducting command inspection. He handed me a garment bag. Inside was my dress blues. Pressed perfectly. Every ribbon aligned. Every insignia polished. I looked up. "You had these cleaned," he shrugged. "Thought you might need them." That nearly broke me. Not because of the uniform. Because he had noticed what I needed before I asked. That kind of quiet care still catches me off guard. Mercer sat across from me. "You heard from your parents?" I nodded. "And, I don't know." He was silent for a while. Then he said something I've carried with me ever since. "Abigail, forgiveness and access are not the same thing." I looked at him. He folded his hands. "You can forgive someone someday and still refuse to let them keep hurting you today." The words settled somewhere deep. I thought about my father standing on that porch. About my mother looking away. About 20 years of trying to become enough for people who only measured worth by usefulness. And for the first time I considered a possibility I had never allowed myself before. Maybe I didn't need their approval to belong to myself. That night alone in the motel room, I carefully hung my uniform on the closet door. The dark blue fabric caught the yellow lamplight. Brass buttons gleamed. Rows of ribbons marked 2 decades of service, sacrifice, and endurance. For years I had worn that uniform, hoping my father might one day see it and understand my worth. Now I understood something better. Its value had never depended on his recognition. At 7:42 the phone rang again. "Dad." This time I answered. He inhaled sharply. "Abigail." His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I said nothing. Then he spoke the words I never thought Frank Reeves would say. I was wrong. Silence stretched between us. Then quietly, I should have trusted my daughter. Something inside me shifted. Not healed. Not whole. But softened. And for the first time since this began, I wondered if shame had finally reached him the way fear never could. I didn't forgive him that night. But I listened. And sometimes listening is the first crack where grace begins to enter. The next morning I stood in front of the motel mirror and buttoned my dress blues one careful fastening at a time. The motions were automatic. Precise. Familiar. For 21 years this uniform had marked every turning point of my adult life. Promotions. Deployments. Funerals. Homecomings. Victories no civilian would ever hear about. And now somehow it marked this too. Reclamation. I adjusted the ribbons across my chest and looked at my reflection. The woman staring back looked older than she had 2 weeks earlier. Not physically. Something deeper. As though betrayal had burned away the last traces of someone who still believed love could be earned through performance. Outside, Virginia's early sunlight spilled across the motel parking lot. Colonel Mercer was waiting beside his truck, coffee in hand. He looked me over and gave one sharp nod. About time the Army remembered who you are. That made me smile. The drive to Fort Belvoir was quiet. Mercer understood the value of silence. Older soldiers know that some moments deserve room to settle. When we reached post-military, police waved us through the gate with formal salutes. A week earlier, another set of MPS had stripped my authority at my apartment door. Now those same gates opened to welcome me back. Life has a way of restoring balance when truth finally catches up. The ceremony was held in the command auditorium. Nothing extravagant. 100 seats. Flags arranged at the front. Rows of officers and civilian staff already seated when I entered. The room rose as one. For a moment I stopped walking. I hadn't expected that. General Whitaker stood near the podium. He met my eyes and gave the slightest nod. It wasn't ceremony. It was respect. I moved forward and took my place. The general's remarks were brief and direct. He spoke about duty, integrity, the cost of institutional failure when good people are doubted too quickly. Then he turned toward me. Major Abigail Reeves acted exactly as an officer should. Her vigilance exposed one of the most serious procurement fraud operations this command has seen in decades. His voice sharpened. We failed her before verifying the truth. That failure will not happen again. The room was utterly still. Then he pinned the Legion of Merit medal to my jacket. As his hand withdrew, he said quietly enough that only I could hear, "You honored the uniform better than we honored you." Emotion rose so suddenly I nearly lost my composure. But Army discipline held. I saluted. He returned it. The applause that followed was long and steady. And all I could think was this. My father had spent 40 years teaching me that approval had to be earned through perfection. Yet here among people who had every reason to judge harshly, acknowledgement had arrived not because I was flawless, but because I had endured truthfully. After the ceremony, officers approached one by one. Some apologized. Some simply shook my hand. Others said nothing at all, their expressions carrying more sincerity than words ever could. Then I saw my phone. 32 missed calls. 20 from my parents. One voicemail had arrived during the ceremony. I stepped into an empty hallway and played it. Dad's voice came through rough and uneven. "Abigail, the sheriff posted final foreclosure papers this morning." A shaky breath followed. "We have 48 hours. Silence." Then, "I know I don't deserve to ask this, but your mother's terrified." His voice cracked. And suddenly, impossibly, I heard not the commanding father of my childhood, but an aging man confronting consequences he no longer knew how to control. He continued, "I was wrong about everything." A pause. Then the sentence that undid me. "I was so afraid of being ashamed of you, I never noticed how proud I should have been." The voicemail ended. I stood there staring at the blank screen. For years, those were the words I had wanted. A child can survive on very little hope if she believes love is still possible. And now here they were arriving decades late and spoken through defeat. Colonel Mercer found me standing there. He read my expression immediately. "What happened?" I handed him the phone. He listened quietly. When it ended, he looked up. "What are you thinking?" I stared down the long, polished hallway of Fort Belvoir, at young officers walking briskly toward work, at the life I had fought to reclaim. Then I answered honestly, "I think I'm tired of letting pain make my decisions." Mercer said nothing. He didn't need to. By afternoon, I was driving north to Maryland. The highway stretched ahead beneath a pale autumn sky. Every mile carried memory. Family road trips. High school debates with my father. The long drive home after West Point graduation when he had said, "Not bad," like it was praise enough to last a lifetime. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, dusk had settled. The foreclosure notice was taped to the front door. The American flag still hung neatly from the porch. But the house itself looked smaller somehow. Fragile. Like pride had been the only thing holding it upright. I stepped out of the car. And for the first time in my life, I approached that front door with nothing left to prove. The porch light was already on when I walked up the front steps. For a second, my hand hovered over the same brass doorbell I had pressed a week earlier. That morning, I had stood here frightened, disgraced, and desperate for comfort. Tonight, I stood here restored. Not because the army had cleared my name. Not because the uniform on my shoulders carried fresh recognition. But because somewhere between losing everything and getting it back, I had stopped measuring my worth by whether this door opened for me. I pressed the bell. Footsteps shuffled inside. Then the door opened. My father looked smaller than I remembered. Frank Reeves had always filled a room through sheer force of certainty. Even in retirement, he carried himself like a man who believed control was his birthright. That certainty was gone now. His shoulders sagged. His neatly combed gray hair looked thinner. The skin beneath his eyes had hollowed into shadows. And when he saw me standing there in full dress blues, his face folded in on itself. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped aside. "Please come in." The house smelled exactly as it had my entire childhood lemon polish old books and my mother's lavender hand soap. The familiarity hit harder than I expected. Memory is a strange thing. It can ache even when attached to pain. Mom stood in the living room near the fireplace, twisting a handkerchief between trembling fingers. The moment she saw me, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Abby," I gave a small nod. Not cold, not warm, simply present. She crossed the room and stopped a few feet away as though uncertain she had the right to come closer. That hurt more than anger would have, because it meant she knew what she'd done. We sat in the living room where I had opened Christmas gifts as a child and studied for SAT exams under my father's stern supervision. Now silence filled every corner. Finally, Dad spoke. The bank accelerated the foreclosure after Redstone's assets were frozen. I frowned. "What does Redstone have to do with your mortgage?" His expression tightened. Then shame darkened his face. Years seemed to settle into him all at once. He looked suddenly old. 3 years ago, he said quietly, "I invested our retirement funds with a private equity group." A sick feeling stirred in my stomach. He kept going. "They promised stable returns, conservative growth. They were backed through Redstone affiliates." Of course they were. Contractor shell money laundering often flowed through respectable-looking retirement instruments. For older investors, it was a familiar trap trust, the polished men with brochures and percentages. Dad stared at his hands. "When your account became accessible, I used it to cover our mortgage while waiting for the investments to recover." I felt something inside me go still. Not rage. Not even shock. Just clarity. For years, he had quietly depended on my money while presenting himself as the provider. The man who had lectured me about responsibility had been surviving on my sacrifices while calling it family stewardship. Mom's voice broke through. I knew some of it. I looked at her. She wept openly now. I told myself he'd fix it. I told myself families help each other. But I knew it wasn't right. There it was. The truth at last. Not monsters. Not villains. Just frightened people whose pride had slowly made cowards of them. Dad looked up at me then, and his voice cracked. "I emptied your account because I panicked." He swallowed hard. "When the military investigation hit the news, I thought everything would be seized. I thought if I protected what was left." "What was left?" I asked quietly. He flinched. The question hung there. What was left after years of taking from a daughter he had never truly seen? Tears filled his eyes. The sight stunned me. Frank Reeves did not cry. Not when his own father died. Not when Mom survived breast cancer. Not when I deployed to Afghanistan. But now tears slipped down his face unchecked. And he whispered the words I never thought I would hear. I threw away my child to save a house and still lost both. The room went silent. I looked at this man who had shaped so much of my life through absence disguised as discipline. And for the first time I saw him clearly. Not as the giant whose approval I had chased. Not as the judge whose standards defined me. Just an aging man who had spent his life worshipping control until it cost him the very people he meant to protect. And suddenly I pitied him. Real pity. Not contempt. Not triumph. Mercy. I stood. Both of them looked up frightened I was leaving. Instead, I walked to the front window and looked out at the dark street where I'd once learned to ride a bicycle under my father's watchful eye. Then I turned back. I can stop the foreclosure. Neither of them moved. Dad's face drained of color. Why? It was a fair question. After everything, why? I thought about Colonel Mercer's words. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. Then I answered. Because if I let bitterness decide who I become, then this wins twice. Mom covered her mouth and sobbed. Dad stared at me like he no longer recognized the daughter standing before him. Maybe he didn't. The frightened girl who once begged for scraps of his approval was gone. In her place stood a woman who had finally learned this. Mercy offered freely is not weakness. It is freedom. The next morning I wired enough money to halt proceedings. Not to erase the past. Not to pretend trust was restored overnight, but to make room for something better than revenge. That evening, after the paperwork cleared, Dad met me at the front door as I prepared to leave. His eyes were red. His hands shook slightly. For a moment he said nothing. Then very softly he spoke my full name. Welcome home, Abigail Reeves. Not ownership. Not expectation. Just pride. At last freely given. I smiled. And this time when he opened his arms I stepped into them. Some wounds never fully disappear. But healing begins the moment we stop asking pain to tell us who we are. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you've ever had to choose grace when anger felt easier, I hope you'll carry that reflection with you, and perhaps share it with someone who needs it. And if stories like this remind you that it's never too late for truth healing and second chances, I'd be honored if you stayed for the next one. The room went silent the moment the camera zoomed in on the cockpit. My brother dropped his beer. My mother covered her mouth. My father leaned forward so quickly that his recliner nearly tipped. And for the first time in years, nobody said a word. On the television screen, the announcer's voice echoed across the living room. Leading today's demonstration flight is Major Emily Parker. My name, my face, my aircraft. Broadcast live to millions of Americans. The same brother who had called me the family failure stared at the screen as if he'd seen a ghost. The same parents who had spent years defending him couldn't look away. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because the pilot flying across the sky wasn't some stranger. It was me, the daughter they'd overlooked, the sister they'd underestimated, the woman they'd stopped believing in years ago. And the strangest part? I had never lied to them. Not once. They simply never cared enough to ask. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back long before the television cameras. Back before the Air Force. Back before the uniforms. Back before the air shows. Back to a small town in Texas. Back to the day my brother's dream became my burden. And eventually, my future. My name is Emily Parker. I'm 34 years old now. But this story really began when I was a little girl growing up outside Wichita Falls, Texas. Back then, everybody knew who Jake Parker was. Jake was my older brother. 3 years older. 3 years louder. 3 years more confident. And according to nearly everyone who knew us, 3 years more talented. If there was a baseball game, Jake was the star. If there was a school event, Jake got attention. If there was a family gathering, relatives asked about Jake first. I wasn't ignored exactly. I was simply second. Second place becomes familiar when you're the younger sibling of someone everybody expects great things from. The funny thing is that I adored him. I really did. When I was 7 years old, I wanted to wear the same baseball cap he wore. When I was 10, I copied the way he talked. When I was 12, I followed him around so much that he started calling me his shadow. Most little sisters probably understand that feeling. The desire to be included, the desire to belong, the desire to hear an older sibling say they were proud of you. Back then, Jake was my hero. And Jake had one dream: flying. He loved airplanes. Loved them. Our bedroom walls were covered with aircraft posters, fighter jets, bombers, military aviation magazines stacked everywhere. Air shows were practically holidays in our family. Every summer, Dad loaded us into the truck before sunrise. We'd drive for hours just to watch military aircraft roar across the Texas sky. Jake would stand there with his eyes locked on the horizon, completely mesmerized. One year after watching an F-16 demonstration team perform, he turned to Dad and said something I'll never forget. "One day that'll be me." Dad smiled. "I believe it." Mom smiled too. So do I. Nobody laughed. Nobody doubted him. Not for a second. And honestly, neither did I. Because Jake had the kind of confidence that made other people believe. As we got older, the dream only grew. Jake joined Civil Air Patrol, earned flight experience, studied aviation constantly. Everything in his life pointed toward becoming a military pilot. By high school, teachers talked about him like he was already destined for greatness. The future seemed written. Then reality arrived. It arrived quietly, in the form of a medical examination. I was 15 when it happened. Jake was 18. I remember the day he came home. No excitement, no smile, no celebration, just silence. The kind of silence that tells you something important has broken. Dad sat with him at the kitchen table for hours. Mom cried. Nobody explained anything to me. Not immediately. I eventually learned the truth. Jake had failed a medical qualification required for the flight path he wanted. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked skill. His body simply didn't meet the standard. Years of dreaming ended in a single appointment. Just like that, the Air Force dream disappeared, and something inside Jake disappeared with it. The months afterward were difficult, harder than anyone expected. Jake became angry, then withdrawn, then bitter. Not all at once, slowly, like watching a storm gather in the distance. At first, everyone understood, even me. Losing a dream hurts, especially when you've built your identity around it. Mom and Dad became protective, extremely protective. Every conversation revolved around Jake. Every family decision revolved around Jake. Every concern revolved around Jake. Again, I understood, at least initially. But over time, something changed. The family didn't just comfort him. They began excusing him. Everything. His temper, his attitude, his mistakes, his complaints. No matter what happened, the explanation was always the same. He's been through a lot. And he had. But eventually that explanation became permission. Permission to stay angry. Permission to blame others. Permission to stop moving forward. Meanwhile, life kept moving, including mine. One afternoon while helping Dad clean the garage, I found an old aviation magazine. The cover featured an Air Force pilot climbing into a fighter jet. I stared at the image for several minutes. Something stirred inside me. The same feeling Jake used to talk about. The same excitement. The same fascination. That night, I started researching military aviation. Quietly. Secretly. I never told anyone. Not even Jake. Especially not Jake, because by then I already knew how he'd react. The dream belonged to him, not me. At least that's what everyone seemed to believe. Years passed. I graduated high school. Worked hard. Stayed focused. Made plans. Whenever I talked about military service, Jake rolled his eyes. Whenever I talked about aviation, he laughed. The first time he called me the family failure, I was 21. We were sitting around the dinner table. I had just mentioned applying for officer training. Jake smirked. That's ambitious. Dad looked uncomfortable. Mom stared at her plate. I ignored the comment. Then Jake laughed. You've always been the family failure, Emily. Silence. Nobody corrected him. Nobody defended me. Nobody said a word. The silence hurt more than the insult, because silence can sound a lot like agreement. I looked around the table. My parents avoided eye contact. Jake leaned back in his chair, satisfied. And that's when I learned an important lesson. Sometimes the people who should protect you simply don't. Not because they don't love you, because they're too busy protecting someone else. I never argued, never fought back, never demanded fairness. I simply smiled and kept moving forward. Because while my family was still focused on the dream Jake lost, I was quietly preparing to chase it myself, and none of them had any idea how far I was willing to go. The first time I sat in the cockpit of a military training aircraft, I thought about my brother. Not because he was there. He wasn't. Not because he supported me. He didn't. I thought about him because I knew I was sitting inside the dream he had wanted his entire life. And for a brief moment I felt guilty. That feeling didn't last long. Reality has a way of pushing sentiment aside, especially when you're trying not to fail. When people imagine military flight training, they often picture excitement, speed, adventure, the kind of scenes you see in movies. The truth is much less glamorous. Most days were exhausting. Long hours, constant evaluations, endless studying, pressure that never seemed to disappear. I joined the Air Force shortly after college. At first, nobody in my family took it seriously. Mom assumed it was temporary. Dad thought I'd eventually come home. Jake laughed outright. How long before you quit? I remember that question clearly. We were standing in my parents' driveway. The Texas sun was setting. I'd just finished loading my luggage into the trunk of my car. I looked at him. I'm not quitting. He shrugged. We'll see. That was it. No good luck. No encouragement. No brotherly support. Just doubt. The strange thing is that by then I'd become accustomed to it. Low expectations are surprisingly easy to carry once you've carried them long enough. Military life changed me quickly. Not because it made me tougher, because it forced me to discover how tough I already was. The first year was difficult. Really difficult. There were moments I questioned everything. Moments when failure seemed more likely than success. The standards were demanding. The competition was intense. Everyone around me had talent. Everyone around me wanted the same opportunities. Nobody cared about excuses. Nobody cared about your feelings. Results mattered. Performance mattered. Discipline mattered. And I loved it. For the first time in my life, nobody compared me to Jake. Nobody saw me as somebody's little sister. Nobody viewed me through the lens of family history. I was simply Emily Parker. Responsible for my own success. Responsible for my own failures. It was strangely liberating. One evening during training, I found myself sitting alone outside the barracks. The sun had disappeared. The air was cool. Several aircraft were parked in the distance. Their silhouettes stood against the darkening sky. I remember staring at them for a long time, thinking about home, thinking about family, thinking about the version of myself everyone back in Texas still believed existed. The family failure. The girl who would never accomplish much. The girl nobody worried about because she wasn't the important one. It struck me then how strange life can be. The people who know us longest don't always know us best. Sometimes they become attached to an old version of who we were, even after we've changed, even after we've grown, even after we've become someone entirely different. Boo. Meanwhile, Jake remained the center of gravity back home. At least according to my parents. Every phone call followed the same pattern. Mom would spend 20 minutes talking about Jake, his job, his frustrations, his latest problem, his newest plan. Then she'd ask about me, briefly. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just habit. Years of family dynamics are hard to break. One Christmas I returned home on leave. The visit lasted 4 days. By the second evening, Jake had already found a way to mock my career. We were sitting in the living room watching football. A commercial featuring military aircraft appeared on television. Jake pointed toward the screen. Remember when I wanted to do that? Nobody answered. He looked at me. I guess somebody had to settle for second place. Mom laughed nervously. Dad cleared his throat. Nobody challenged him. Again. I sat quietly. Again. The silence no longer surprised me. What surprised me was how little it hurt. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped needing their approval. Not completely, but enough. Enough to keep moving. Enough to stay focused. Enough to understand that their opinion wasn't my future. The irony was that Jake himself had inspired my love of aviation. I don't think he ever realized that. When we were kids, I followed him everywhere. Air museums, aviation shows, books about fighter jets, flight simulators. Every interest he loved eventually became something I loved too. The difference was simple. When his path closed, he stopped walking. When mine became difficult, I kept going. That wasn't because I was stronger. It was because by the time I started, I already knew nobody was coming to save me. Nobody was going to carry me. Nobody was going to lower the standards. The responsibility belonged to me. And somehow that made all the difference. So, several years passed. My career advanced steadily. I earned qualifications, completed advanced training. accepted increasingly challenging assignments. Each accomplishment felt meaningful, not because anyone back home noticed, because I knew how hard I'd worked for it. Success feels different when you've earned it quietly. There's no applause, no celebration, no audience, just private satisfaction, the knowledge that you kept your promises to yourself. One afternoon I received a call from my mother. The conversation began normally. Weather, family news, small-town gossip. Then she casually mentioned Jake. He's been having a rough time lately. I wasn't surprised. There always seemed to be something. What happened? Work isn't going well. I listened, as always. Then she sighed. You know, your brother had such big dreams. The comment wasn't intended to hurt me, but it did. Because I realized something. Even after all these years, my family still viewed Jake as the dreamer. The one with potential. The one whose future mattered. Meanwhile, I was actively living the life he'd once wanted. And somehow they still didn't see it. Not because I hid it. Because they never looked. A few months later, everything changed. I was stationed at an Air Force base in Nevada when the email arrived. At first, I assumed it was routine. Another administrative notice. Another scheduling update. Something ordinary. Instead, it contained an invitation. An opportunity. The kind of opportunity military aviators spend years hoping for. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. My hands were shaking slightly by the time I finished. Because the selection board had chosen me for something extraordinary. Something prestigious. Something that would place me on a national stage. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen, unable to process it. Then I thought about Jake, about my parents, about every family dinner where I'd been overlooked, about every joke, every dismissal, every moment of silence, and for the first time I wondered what would happen if they ever discovered who I had become. For most of my career, I believed success would feel dramatic. I imagined some life-changing moment, a celebration, a speech, a crowd applauding. Instead, one of the biggest moments of my life happened in a quiet office while I sat alone in front of a computer screen. No audience, no music, no fanfare, just an email, and a future I never saw coming. I must have read the message 10 times, maybe more. The words never changed. Neither did the outcome. I had been selected for one of the most prestigious aviation demonstration assignments in the Air Force. The selection process was brutally competitive. Outstanding pilots from across the service applied. Most never made it. Many applied more than once. Some spent years hoping for the opportunity. And somehow my name had ended up on the list. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. Aircraft moved across the flight line outside. Maintenance crews worked beneath the Nevada sun. Everything looked exactly the same. But nothing felt the same. Because after years of quiet effort, somebody had noticed. Somebody had looked beyond evaluations and flight hours and seen potential. The realization was overwhelming, not because I needed validation, because I'd spent so many years without it. That evening I called my parents. Part of me wanted to share the news. Part of me still hoped. Even after all those years, even after all the disappointments, there is something inside most daughters that never fully stops wanting their parents to be proud. Mom answered on the second ring. We exchanged the usual greetings, talked about weather, neighbors, family updates. Then I told her, I got selected for something important. Oh, there was genuine interest in her voice. I smiled. One of the biggest opportunities of my career. That's wonderful, honey. For a moment I felt encouraged. Then she asked, did I tell you Jake is thinking about changing jobs? And just like that, the moment disappeared. Not because she meant to hurt me. Because old habits are powerful. The conversation drifted back toward Jake, as it always seemed to. 20 minutes later, we hung up. I sat staring at my phone. Not angry. Not even disappointed. Mostly resigned. I understood my family by then. The rules rarely changed. The following months became some of the busiest of my life. The new assignment required additional preparation, additional training, additional responsibilities. The standards were higher. The expectations were higher. Everything was higher. I loved every minute of it. The work demanded precision, professionalism, discipline. Every detail mattered. Every maneuver mattered. Every decision mattered. There was no room for complacency. And strangely enough, that made me feel alive. Because for years I had quietly carried other people's expectations. Now I was focused entirely on my own. Back home, however, very little changed, at least not from my family's perspective. Whenever I visited Texas, I seemed to step back into the same role. The overlooked daughter, the younger sister, the safe target. One summer afternoon, my parents hosted a family barbecue, the kind of gathering common across America. Paper plates, lawn chairs, children running through sprinklers, country music playing softly in the background. Everybody relaxed, everybody comfortable, at least until Jake arrived. By then he was 37, still charismatic, still funny, still capable of making an entire group laugh. The difference was that the laughter felt different now, less joyful, more defensive. Success had never fully replaced the dream he'd lost, and I think part of him knew it. I was helping Dad near the grill when Jake walked over. Emily. Jake. He glanced at my sunglasses, then at my Air Force shirt. A familiar smirk appeared. I knew what was coming. Some things never change. So how's the military? It's good. You still doing that? I laughed softly. Last time I checked, several relatives nearby chuckled. Jake shook his head dramatically. I figured you'd be tired of playing soldier by now. The conversation around us grew quieter. People sensed tension. They always did. Nobody intervened. They rarely did. I looked at him. I like what I do. He shrugged. Good for you. Then he took a sip of his drink. And here I thought you'd eventually get a real job. Several people laughed awkwardly. The kind of laughter people use when they don't know what else to do. I noticed my mother looking down, my father focusing on the grill. Neither said anything. Again, the moment should have hurt. Years earlier it would have. Instead, I found myself feeling something unexpected. Pity. Not for myself. For Jake. Because I suddenly realized he was still fighting a battle that had ended years ago. The dream was gone. The disappointment was real. But he refused to leave that chapter behind. And it was costing him. That evening, after most of the guests had gone home, I sat alone on my parents' back porch. The Texas sky stretched endlessly overhead. Crickets filled the darkness. The air smelled like cut grass and barbecue smoke. Dad eventually joined me. For several minutes we sat quietly. Then he sighed. Your brother gives you a hard time. I smiled. A little. He stared toward the yard. You know he doesn't mean all of it. There it was. The familiar defense. The explanation. The excuse. I had heard versions of it for years. Normally I let it pass. This time I didn't. Dad. Yeah. When was the last time somebody asked him to stop? The question lingered. Neither of us spoke. Finally he looked away. And that answer told me everything. A few weeks later, a major television network announced coverage of an upcoming national air show. The event would attract enormous attention. Millions of viewers. National exposure. The kind of aviation spectacle people planned weekends around. I knew immediately that my family would watch. Jake never missed an air show. Never. Even after all these years. Especially not one this big. The irony wasn't lost on me. The little girl who had followed her brother through aviation museums and air shows was now preparing to fly in one. Not as a spectator. Not as a fan. As part of the show itself. Yet nobody back home knew. Not Jake. Not Mom. Not Dad. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in telling them. Because some truths don't need announcements. Sometimes life reveals them on its own. And when it does, the lesson tends to be unforgettable. The morning of the air show began long before sunrise. Most people only see the performance.
The aircraft.
The smoke trails. The precision formations. The applause. They don't see the preparation. The briefings. The inspections. The hours of planning. The responsibility. And they certainly don't see the quiet moments when a pilot sits alone and realizes thousands, sometimes millions of people are about to watch. I remember standing beside the aircraft while the sky was still dark. The air was cool. The flight line lights reflected against polished metal. Ground crews moved efficiently around us. Everything felt calm, professional, routine. Yet beneath that routine was excitement. Not nervous excitement, gratitude. Because I knew exactly how many people would have traded places with me, including my brother. A few hundred miles away, my family was starting their day too. Though I wouldn't learn the details until later. According to my mother, Jake arrived early, earlier than anyone expected. He carried coffee and donuts, the way he used to whenever a big air show was on television. Apparently he was excited, like a kid again. That part made me smile when I heard it later. Because despite everything, Jake had never stopped loving aviation. Not really. He had simply stopped believing it could be part of his own future. Those are very different things. Back at the airfield, pilots gathered for the final briefing. Weather, safety procedures, flight schedules, communication plans. The usual details. Everyone focused. Everyone professional. Nobody treated the day casually. The crowd expected perfection. And perfection requires preparation. As the briefing concluded, one of the senior officers looked around the room, then smiled. "Let's give them a show they'll remember." The room responded with quiet confidence. Not arrogance. Professional pride. There is a difference. Meanwhile, my parents had settled into the living room. My father occupied his favorite recliner. My mother sat on the couch. Jake claimed the seat closest to the television. Some things never change. The network coverage began around noon. Commentators discussed aircraft, pilots, history, upcoming demonstrations. Jake reportedly corrected the announcers several times, at least according to my mother. That sounded exactly like him. For all his flaws, he knew aviation. Always had. He pointed out aircraft models, explained maneuvers, shared facts nobody else knew. For a little while, the old Jake returned. The enthusiastic boy from those childhood air shows. The brother I used to admire. The brother I missed. By early afternoon, I was climbing into the cockpit. That moment never gets old. The smell, the equipment, the routine. Every pilot develops habits, personal rituals, small actions that signal it's time to focus. I followed mine carefully. Checklists, communications, systems, everything exactly as trained. Everything exactly as practiced. Then I looked out across the airfield. Thousands of spectators filled the viewing areas. Families, veterans, children, aviation enthusiasts, people from all over America. Some wore military hats decorated with unit patches. Others carried folding chairs and cameras. Many had been attending air shows for decades. I felt honored to be there. Truly. Because opportunities like this don't belong to one person. They're built on years of support from instructors, mentors, crews, and teammates. Nobody reaches that stage alone. The demonstration began. Aircraft launched. Formations assembled. The performance unfolded exactly as planned. From the cockpit, the world looked different. Cleaner. Simpler. Focused. There is a unique clarity that comes during flight. The noise disappears. The distractions disappear. Only the mission remains. For a while, family never entered my mind. Neither did Jake. I was too busy flying. Too busy doing the job? Back in Texas, the television broadcast continued. The commentators introduced various segments. Different aircraft. Different pilots. Different demonstrations. My family watched casually. Interested. Entertained. Completely unaware of what was coming. Then the production team switched to a featured segment. A closer look at one of the demonstration pilots. The camera followed a pilot walking toward an aircraft. Helmet under one arm. Flight gear perfectly fitted. Professional. Confident. The announcer began speaking. And everything changed. According to my father, Jake stopped moving first. Not speaking. Not breathing. Moving. The announcer continued. Leading today's demonstration is Major Emily Parker. My name. Clear as day. Impossible to misunderstand. My mother later told me she thought she'd heard it wrong. She looked at the screen. Then looked again. Then sat frozen. The camera zoomed closer. Close enough to remove all doubt. There I was. Not someone who looked like me. Not someone with the same name. Me. The daughter. The sister. The family failure. Elio. The room went completely silent. Nobody knew what to say. For years, they had imagined my military career as something small, ordinary, temporary. Background noise. Now reality was sitting in their living room. Broadcast nationwide. Impossible to ignore. The silence lasted several seconds. Maybe longer. Nobody remembers exactly. Shock has a strange effect on time. The aircraft accelerated. The demonstration continued. And for the next several minutes, my family watched without speaking. Every maneuver. Every formation. Every pass across the sky. Jake never looked away. Neither did my parents. Years of assumptions were collapsing in real time. The daughter they overlooked. The sister they underestimated. The dream they thought belonged only to Jake. All of it unfolding before them. Not through an argument. Not through revenge. Not through confrontation. Through truth. When the broadcast ended, nobody rushed to speak. Nobody joked. Nobody changed the subject. The room remained quiet. My father eventually stood. Walked into the kitchen. Then came back. Still speechless. My mother wiped tears from her eyes. Jake remained seated, staring at the blank television screen. The same screen that had just revealed everything. The next morning, while I was reviewing post-event schedules at my temporary quarters, somebody knocked on the door. A firm knock. Unexpected. I opened it and found my brother standing there. He looked exhausted, like a man who hadn't slept. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Jake took a deep breath and said the last thing I ever expected to hear from him. "We need to talk." For most of my life, I imagined what I would say if Jake ever admitted he was wrong. I pictured arguments, long speeches, years of frustration finally pouring out. I imagined telling him exactly how much he'd hurt me, exactly how many family dinners I'd endured, exactly how many times I'd sat quietly while everyone acted as if my life didn't matter. But when I opened that door and saw him standing there, none of those speeches seemed important anymore. Because Jake didn't look like a man ready to argue. He looked like a man carrying something heavy, something he'd been carrying for years. Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. Sure. The room was quiet, small, temporary. Military housing isn't glamorous. Never has been. Jake looked around. His eyes settled on framed photographs sitting on a shelf. Flight school. Graduation ceremonies. Squadron pictures.
Awards.
Years of memories. Years of work. Evidence of a life he had never bothered to ask about. For several moments he simply stared. Then he shook his head. "I didn't know." "No," I said gently. "You didn't." We sat across from each other at a small kitchen table, the same way we'd sat across from each other at hundreds of family meals. Yet this felt entirely different. For once, nobody else was there. No parents, no relatives, no audience. Just us. Jake folded his hands together, then unfolded them, then folded them again. A nervous habit I'd almost forgotten he had. Finally, he spoke. "When did all this happen?" I smiled. "What part?" He gestured toward the photographs. "The career." "The flying." "The air show." I laughed softly. "Over the last 12 years. The answer wasn't meant to be sarcastic. But it landed that way anyway. Because the truth was obvious. My life hadn't been a secret. He simply hadn't been paying attention. Jake stared down at the table. "I feel stupid." I considered that, then shook my head. "No." His eyes lifted. "No. No, I think you're finally being honest." That answer seemed to surprise him. For several seconds he sat quietly. Then he nodded. "Fair enough." The conversation moved slowly after that, like two people trying to cross a damaged bridge. Carefully, one step at a time. Eventually, Jake leaned back in his chair. "I hated watching that air show." The statement caught me off guard. "Hated it." He nodded. "I was proud of you." Then he looked away, and I hated it. Now I understood. Not because I shared his feelings, because I finally understood their source. "Why?" I asked. Jake laughed bitterly. "Because that was supposed to be me." There it was. The truth. Not jealousy. Not really. Grief. Old grief. Unresolved grief. The kind people carry so long they forget they're carrying it. For the next hour, Jake talked more honestly than I had ever heard him talk before. He told me about the medical disqualification, the embarrassment, the humiliation, the feeling of watching his future disappear. I already knew most of the facts. What I didn't know were the emotions behind them. The fear, the shame, the anger, the loneliness. For years, everyone had focused on the dream he lost. Very few people had focused on the person who lost it, including Jake himself. I kept thinking I'd find something else," he admitted. "Something that felt the same." "Did you?" He shook his head. "No." The answer came immediately. Too immediately. The kind of answer somebody has lived with for years. "I got jobs." He shrugged. "I made money." "I paid bills." "But none of it ever felt like flying." I nodded, understanding more than he realized. Because every person reaches a point where they discover the difference between making a living and feeling alive. Jake never found the second part. Then his eyes met mine. "And then there was you." I stayed quiet. "You kept going." Another pause. "You lived the dream." The words sounded painful, but also freeing. Like finally admitting something he'd spent years avoiding. I nodded slowly. "Yes." For the first time in my life, I didn't minimize it. Didn't soften it. Didn't apologize for it. I had earned it. And both of us knew it. Jake rubbed his face. "I think I started blaming you." The honesty startled me, even though I'd suspected it for years. "You?" He nodded. "It didn't make sense." I knew that. "But every time you succeeded," his voice trailed off. I finished the sentence for him. "It reminded you." He nodded. "Exactly. Every achievement, every promotion, every step forward, had reminded him of the path he'd lost. And because he couldn't fight the loss, he fought the reminder. Me. The strange thing was that hearing the truth didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Because I suddenly saw how much energy he'd wasted. Years of resentment. Years of comparison. Years spent staring backward instead of forward. And for what? Nothing. Not 1 minute of it had changed the past. A few days later, our parents joined us for dinner. The atmosphere was awkward at first. Nobody quite knew how to begin. Then my mother surprised everyone, including herself. She started crying. Not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of crying that comes from realization. "We failed you," she said. I blinked. "What?" She looked directly at me. "We failed you." The room went silent. Dad stared at the table. Jake looked down. Mom continued. "We were so worried about your brother." Her voice trembled. "We forgot you needed us too." I didn't know what to say. Because I'd imagined apologies before. Many times. But reality felt different. Messier. More human. Less satisfying. And somehow more meaningful. Dad finally spoke. "We thought we were helping him." "You were," I said. He nodded. "Maybe." Then he sighed. "But we stopped seeing what it was costing you." Nobody argued. Because everybody knew it was true. Eventually the conversation softened. The tension eased. The honesty remained. For the first time in years, we weren't pretending. And that mattered. More than revenge. More than being right. More than winning. Before leaving that evening, Jake walked me to my car. The sun was beginning to set. The sky glowed orange over the Texas horizon. He stood quietly for a moment, then asked a question. A simple question, but one that carried the weight of years. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I looked at him, and for the first time I knew exactly how to answer. For years I thought I knew exactly how I would answer that question. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I imagined saying something dramatic, something sharp, something that would finally make everyone understand. But standing there beside my car looking at my brother, I realized the answer was much simpler than that. "I did tell you." Jake frowned. "What?" "I told you every time somebody asked." The confusion remained. So I smiled. "I joined the Air Force." He nodded. "I know." "I told you when I graduated training." Another nod. "I told you when I got promoted." "Yeah, I told you when I changed assignments." His expression slowly shifted. The pieces were finally connecting. I wasn't talking about secrets. I was talking about attention. For years, the information had been available. Nobody had listened. Not really. Not completely. Not with genuine curiosity. Jake stared toward the fading horizon, then laughed quietly. A sad laugh. The kind people make when they finally recognize a truth they'd spent years avoiding. "We never asked." No, we didn't. And somehow those 3 words carried more honesty than anything he'd said before. Oh, on the flight home the next day I spent a lot of time looking out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft. The world seemed peaceful from 30,000 feet. Smaller somehow. Less complicated. Distance has a way of doing that. Problems that feel enormous on the ground often look different from above. Not insignificant. Just easier to understand. For years I had carried resentment toward my family. Not overwhelming resentment. Not hatred. Just a quiet ache. The ache of feeling unseen. The ache of watching someone else's pain matter more than your own. The ache of realizing that being the dependable child often means receiving less attention than the struggling one. Many people my age understand that feeling, especially those who grew up in families where one person's crisis became everybody else's priority. Looking down at those clouds, I finally understood something. My parents hadn't loved me less. They had simply worried about Jake more. Those aren't the same thing, and while that realization didn't erase the hurt, it helped me understand it. Understanding changes things. Over the next several months, something unusual happened. My family started paying attention. Not in a dramatic way. Not overnight. Slowly. Naturally. Mom called more often. Not to discuss Jake, to ask about me. The first time it happened, I almost laughed. She called one evening while I was making dinner. After a few minutes of conversation, she asked, "So what are you working on these days?" I actually paused because I couldn't remember the last time she'd asked. Not politely. Not out of obligation. With genuine interest. We spent nearly 40 minutes talking. About aviation. Travel. Career goals. Life. When we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. Smiling. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives through small questions that should have been asked years ago. Dad changed too, though in his own way. One afternoon he mailed me a newspaper clipping, a local article about aviation. Nothing particularly special, except for the handwritten note attached. Saw this and thought of you. Love, Dad. That was it. 12 words. Yet I probably read them 20 times. Because after years of feeling overlooked, even small signs of recognition carry enormous weight. So, the biggest change, however, came from Jake. Not immediately. Growth rarely happens immediately. But it happened. Gradually. Steadily. One choice at a time. For the first time in years, he stopped comparing our lives. Stopped measuring his losses against my successes. Stopped treating every accomplishment of mine as evidence of his failure. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was something better. It was real. One evening he called me unexpectedly. I signed up for flight lessons. I nearly dropped my phone. What? He laughed. You heard me. I sat down, honestly stunned. At 37 years old, Jake wasn't trying to become a fighter pilot. That chapter was over. He knew it. I knew it. But for the first time in nearly 2 decades, he was reconnecting with the thing he loved instead of mourning the thing he lost. That mattered. A lot. How was it? I asked. There was a pause. Then I heard something I hadn't heard from him in years. Pure excitement. It was incredible. And just like that, I heard the boy from those childhood air shows again. The boy who stared at airplanes with wonder. The boy who dreamed without bitterness. The boy I'd missed. The following summer, another major air show came to Texas. This time my family attended in person. Not because I asked, because they wanted to. Mom brought sunscreen. Dad brought binoculars. Jake showed up wearing an aviation cap that looked older than some of the spectators. The sight made me laugh. Before the event began, we stood together near the flight line. The sun was bright. The crowd was enormous. Children pointed toward aircraft. Veterans shared stories. Families spread blankets across the grass. America has a special relationship with air shows. They're part celebration, part history lesson, part family tradition. Standing there with my parents and my brother felt strangely emotional, not because I was flying, because for the first time in years we were sharing the experience together. No resentment, no competition, no old arguments, just family. Later that afternoon, after the demonstration ended, we sat together watching the crowd disperse. Jake nudged my shoulder. A familiar gesture from childhood. I was wrong about you. I smiled. You were wrong about a lot of things. He laughed. Fair enough. Then his expression softened. I'm proud of you, Em. The words were simple, ordinary. Yet somehow they meant more than any television broadcast ever could. Because this wasn't about being seen by millions of strangers. It was about being seen by the people who mattered. As I look back now, I realize something important. The greatest victory wasn't appearing on television. It wasn't earning wings. It wasn't proving anybody wrong. The greatest victory was learning that my worth never depended on their approval. Not my brother's. Not my parents'. Not anyone's. Once I understood that, everything changed. Success became lighter. Relationships became healthier. Life became richer. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this story. Sometimes the people closest to us don't see us clearly. Sometimes they underestimate us. Sometimes they carry wounds that prevent them from recognizing our strengths. But we don't have to wait for recognition before moving forward. We don't have to wait for applause before becoming who we're meant to be. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, or perhaps a chapter of your own journey, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on it. And if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly working towards something meaningful, remember this. Keep going. The people around you may not see your progress right away. But that doesn't make it any less real. And if you enjoyed spending this time with me, I'd be honored if you'd share your thoughts, share this story with someone who might need it, and join me again for another journey.